from the birth of muscle cars to the very first supercars, the 1960s really were a very good time for motoring. Hello friends, I am Surreal Emile, and welcome back to some more Forza Top Gear laps, and today we're going to be taking a look at some iconic cars from the 1960s. We start today with one of the most famous Grand Tourers of the 60s, the Aston Martin DB5. 325 horsepower, 3,230 pounds of weight. Now, the DB5 is, of course, most well known for being in a lot of films. However, it was also a pretty decent Grand Tourer back in its day. Top speed of around 140 miles per hour meant that it was one of its quickest cars of the day. Anyways, comparing the DB5 to modern vehicles is actually a lot easier than you might think, because with 325 horsepower, that actually puts it around the ballpark of the BMW M235i Coupe, the Nissan 370Z, you know, sort of those modern compact sports cars. 3,230 pounds also puts it in that ballpark as well. You know, the 370Z and the M235i both weigh about that much. However, of course, the DB5 is a much older car, and being a much older car, it can have some issues. However, the DB5 was surprisingly good. Very decent car to drive, actually, this one. I did enjoy driving this. Decent turning grip, not too much sort of slide action on the way out of corners. It is a little bit soft in the suspension, as you would probably expect from this car. But nevertheless, I mean, if you put race suspension on this and a few other upgrades, this could be a fantastic car. Another thing that I really like about the DB5 is the noise. This thing makes an absolutely amazing engine sound. It's great. It really is fantastic. So yeah, I definitely recommend giving the DB5 a try out, and if you put some upgrades into it, I can imagine it'd be a pretty unusual race car for you. Next up, we have one of the very first muscle/pony cars, the Ford Mustang GT from 1965. This one has 271 horsepower and weighs 2,562 pounds. Now, the Mustang, of course, is most well known for being one of the more iconic muscle cars, if not the most iconic muscle car. This thing sold over 1 million units within its first few years, and it was very, very successful, and it sort of kick-started America's muscle car trend. However, if you look at the statistics on paper, they're not actually all that impressive. 271 horsepower really isn't a lot for a muscle car, especially when you compare it to other muscle cars from the 60s and the early 70s. However, weight-wise, 2,562 pounds. American muscle cars get a lot of flack for being heavy. The Mustang is not heavy. 2,562 pounds isn't that much off the Lotus Exige S, I believe. And, you know, that's a fully stripped-out, lightweight sports car. As a result, how does the Mustang handle? It handles like a muscle car. Unfortunately, it doesn't handle like a Lotus. It handles like a muscle car. It is a little bit on the slidey side. It's a little bit soft. And, well, because it's sort of built to allow people to have as much speed as possible for a little cost as possible, the differential on this one is wide open. I will say, in the rain, a wide differential doesn't actually seem to affect the car as much as it would in the dry, because the car doesn't dig its tyre into the gravel. It can sort of spin it on the water and it'll eventually gain traction again, which is interesting. Anyways, next up we have a Mini Cooper S from 1965, 75 horsepower, 1,480 pounds of weight. As you may probably expect, this is by far and away the least powerful vehicle here today. In fact, the next least powerful vehicle to this has 85 more horsepower than this one does. However, it does only weigh 1,480 pounds, which is extremely light, as in that's like approaching on Lotus 11 territory. So, what is the Mini Cooper like to actually drive? Well, I wasn't too sure. Of course, this is the first time that a Mini Cooper has ever gone round the Top Gear track, at least in my seasons that I've done. And I've never driven this car before stock, really, so I was kind of curious to see how it would handle. And, well, it's fantastic. This thing is so much fun to drive. It has absolutely great handling. It is, you just chuck this thing into corners and it'll go around them. It can actually take a decent amount of corner speed as well. Now, of course, you know, if you put more power into it, I can imagine it would unbalance it a bit. Of course, you know, it's got an open differential. You can't feel it with this much power. However, if you used to put a bit more into it, you'd probably feel those old tyres, the old diff, and so on and so forth. However, if this thing had like 100 horsepower, this could be a pretty decent car around this track, certainly. It isn't too bad with 75 horsepower. Is it going to be rivaling for the top spot? No. However, it is still a pretty fun car to drive. Maybe not the quickest round the track. However, with some upgrades, these things definitely can be very, very quick indeed. And if you haven't already, I do seriously go and recommend you drive the Cooper, because it is a fantastic little car to drive, this one. So much character, so fun to drive. Now the complete opposite, we have a Ford GT40 now, 485 horsepower, 2,682 pounds. Of course, this is the car that dominated Le Mans for much of the late 60s. So, it is of course an iconic car. Now, we've had the GT40 go around a few times, and well, this time round it was no different to all the others. I'm going to complain about the gearbox for a bit. The gearbox in the GT40 is horrible. Basically, it'll do 80 miles per hour in first gear, I believe, and then from there it'll do 130-ish in second, and to be honest with you, after that it doesn't really matter around top gear. I didn't get this thing out of second gear, you know, you don't need the third gear around top gear. Other than that though, it is pretty darn decent on the handling front. This is the most powerful vehicle here today as well, so obviously it is very, very quick. It is by far and away the quickest car we have here today. In a straight line, and indeed maybe even round the track. I guess we'll find out towards the end. Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised by the GT40. I always get amazed with just how good this thing actually handles. I will say it does roll a bit in the corner, that can induce some understeer. However, other than that, the GT40 is a relatively decent car to drive actually, and I do enjoy driving these old Le Mans cars. Next up, we have a Lamborghini Miura, one of the first supercars, 350 horsepower, 2,745 pounds of weight. This is once again another mid-engined rear-drive car, just like the GT40. And power-wise, it's doing pretty darn well. 350 horsepower is certainly on the higher end of vehicles that we have here today. So what is the Miura like to actually drive? Well, it's pretty good. It's a little bit more slidey than I was expecting it to be. Now, of course, you would somewhat expect this car to be slidey. It is it is mid-engined rear drive, and that of course means there's a lot of weight towards the rear of the vehicle. However, it was sliding a bit more than maybe I was expecting it to, but other than that, it wasn't too bad. Straight line speed is relatively decent. It hasn't got anything on the GT40, of course, but then again, it's got 135 less horsepower than the GT40. Also weighs a bit more than the GT40. I get a huge slide there through coming out of Hammerhead right there. Yeah, you can just see how slidey this vehicle was. It was probably one of the more slidey vehicles here today. Still pretty decent fun to drive, and I kind of like the Miura. It is a cool car. Whether it's the first supercar or not is really an argument that you can have with yourselves. However, yeah, it is a very, very good car, this Miura. Again, I believe this is another one that makes a pretty darn decent race car when upgraded. More sliding there. This is more of a sort of drifting showcase than it is an actual Top Gear lap. I was trying to drive this car seriously, honest. Anyways, next up we have a Datsun 240Z, otherwise known as the Nissan Fairlady. 160 horsepower, 2,308 pounds of weight. This is the second least powerful vehicle here today. However, it is of course the second lightest vehicle here today. So, how is the 240Z to drive? Well, just like the Miura, this thing is drifty. This thing really wants to kick the tail end out of. Of course, this is another car that actually never went round the dry track. It's only ever gone round the wet track, which it's doing right now. So I'm not too sure on how this vehicle handles in the dry. However, in the wet, this thing it's a decent amount of fun. It does want to go sideways all the time. Also, it isn't particularly quick. 160 horsepower back in the day sure was decent. However, compared to sort of modern vehicles and even some of the vehicles we have here, it really is lacking on the straight line speed front. Another issue that I had with this car is that the suspension is quite wallowy. Now, admittedly, on the replay cameras you can't actually see it. It doesn't look too bad. However, I can assure you, when you're actually driving it, you can feel the wallowiness of the suspension. It will understeer every now and again because of the amount of wallowiness it's got. That's a really hard word to say. But nevertheless, 240Z was a okay car. Can't say it was one of my favourites to ever drive around here, but nevertheless, it still wasn't a bad car within its own right, and it is a pretty darn cool looking car at that as well. Yeah, Datsun was surprisingly good, shall we say. Or I had a lot more fun with it than I was expecting it too. Anyways, the final car today is the Dodge Charger RT, 425 horsepower, 3,671 pounds of weight. This is the heaviest vehicle here today, and we're getting on to sort of the peak of muscle cars, I guess. Of course, the Charger was one of the more well-known muscle cars. It had the big Hemi V8 in it. 425 horsepower is an awful lot, but then again, so is 3,671 pounds. That's about the same as a Lamborghini Huracan. Oh, sorry, an Audi R8. The Huracan, I think, is like 400 pounds lighter. But anyways, yeah, the Charger, as you would probably expect, it likes to slide, and it has very, very, very good straight line speed, as you'd probably imagine. Again, 425 horsepower is a lot, and despite having the aerodynamical properties of a barn, it certainly doesn't do bad for straight line speed. Yeah, it is a bit too heavy for me. Launching this vehicle is a little bit challenging as well. You get quite a decent amount of wheel spin. Driving this vehicle as a whole is a bit challenging just because it wants to slide. However, it is a huge fun to drive. If you just want to throw this thing around a wet track, it's literally like driving on a drift pan. It is huge amounts of fun to drive this car. Is it the quickest vehicle in the world? No. However, is it a fun car to drive? Yeah, it really is a very, very fun car to drive indeed. Anyways, onto the times, and the Ford GT40 was the fastest car of the day, going into third with a 123.764, beats out a 996 GT3, which is quite good. The Lamborghini Miura also does surprisingly well, going into 8th with a 131.776, beats out a Golf R32. The Dodge Charger RT goes into 10th with a 134.410. And in 11th place is the Aston Martin DB5 with a 135.766. Honestly, I was expecting some of those cars to be a little bit quicker. I guess being in the wet rain didn't particularly help them. Of course, the R32 was a four-wheel drive hot hatch. Moving down the board a bit more, we find the rest of the vehicles. The Mustang goes into 13th with a 137.253. Datsun into 14th with a 138.516, and finally, of course, the doughty little Mini Cooper. Well, its lack of straight line speed really hurt it. Goes into 15th with a 144.965, but still, I highly recommend giving that car a quick go. Anyways, friends, there we go. That was the iconic cars of the 60s. Join me next time when I'm going to be taking a look at the iconic cars from the 1970s. So join me for that. Anyways, friends, as always, if you have themes or suggestions for cars you'd like to see go around the track, just leave them down below in the comment section, and I will certainly consider them. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you all very much for watching. My name has been the Real Emile, and until next time, farewell.